Palworld.
It's the game everyone can't stop talking about, not just because it's breaking playtime and sales records on a daily basis, but because it takes place in a dollar store Hyrule populated by Kirkland's signature Pokémon.
Palworld has been in the news all week, in part because of those records, but also due to accusations of plagiarism.
I mean, look at it. It's a game where you capture monsters to use to fight other monsters. Those monsters are split into types like fire, water, land, electricity, and grass. They also just look like Pokemon. Look, a Pokemon. And another. This one looks like the cat bus from Totoro. Oh look, another Palamon. But public opinion on this matter is divided because Palworld's developers also did something that Pokemon fans are happy about. They made a fun Pokemon game. One where you can collect dozens of pals. One where you can build your own base and force those pals to work for berries. One where you can play online with your friends. One where you can shoot guns and arm the pals with their own guns. One that's got hot tubs and physics. And you can capture the humans? So what do we think of Palworld? Is this plagiarism, content theft, or fair game? Should the Pokemon company do something about it? Or is Palworld's success the cost of not investing in a popular IP?
On today's episode, we're going to talk about the history of Pokemon games and, crucially, the games they haven't made yet. We're going to talk about Palworld, its design and where it's pulling its inspiration from. And then we're going to talk about the motivations of its developers and try and figure out something from this frankly bizarre situation.
And while we're at it, let's talk to a popular Pokemon YouTuber about what he thinks of the current situation.
All right, let's get into it.
Pokemon is a media powerhouse with TV shows, manga, movies, beanbags, skateboards, and costumes. But it's fair to say a lot of Pokemon fans are mostly there for the games, and they've been rewarded with some absolute classics over the years. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Fire Red and Leaf Green, Black and White, Black 2 and White 2, Sword and Shield, Snap, not to mention Pokemon Go. There have been some absolutely fantastic Pokemon games, and as a result, there's a fan base of rabid gamers who are dying for the next Pokemon adventure. The problem is, though, that many of those classic Pokemon games were handheld affairs and often 2D. There have been 3D Pokemon games, but I think it's fair to say they've lacked the ambition of other big-budget open-world games, especially when you consider how large an intellectual property Pokemon really is. This has led to a gaping hole in the heart of many Pokemon fans who crave this type of AAA immersive freeform open world experience. Breath of the Wild didn't exactly help matters when it came out in 2017. It created the AAA open world adventure that Zelda fans were pining for. And while Pokemon Legends attempted to realize the game of fans' dreams, it fell short of the high watermark set by Zelda.
So that's the first part of this problem. Pokemon fans are desperate for that type of AAA immersive monster collecting experience.
So desperate, in fact, that last week millions of them put down their Pokédex to play this thing.
Okay, before we get into this, can we just, for a second, please acknowledge how dumb, how beautifully dumb, the name Palworld is.
And I think there's a truth in that name too. This game, as fun as it is, and it is fun by the way, has been designed to not have an identity of its own. The point of Palworld is that if you squint, it kind of feels like you're playing Pokemon. Pokemon is no stranger to copycats ever since it burst onto the scene in the mid-90s and taught prepubescent children the strategies of cockfighting. Others have tried to steal its thunder. Digimon released just a year after Pokemon and is perhaps the most egregious, though fans of the series will cry to high heaven that it's not ripping off Pokemon at all, but Tamagotchi. To which I reply, why not both? Pokemon was a massive inspiration for the anime that followed, with Beyblade, Yokai Watch, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Owing a lot to its format and success. But the core loop of capturing monsters and forcing them to live in tiny prisons only to release them to fight each other to the death is a uniquely Pokemon flavor. Perhaps the reason I find Palworld so funny is because it's literally ripped from a South Park episode. The Chin Pokemon fad that spread through South Park Elementary had kids arguing over which was the best monster, Furry Cat, Pengen, Lambtron, or Shoe. In fact, the idea of creating a parody of this insanely popular media powerhouse that is Pokemon is so obvious and so played out that even an attempt to do it today seems almost quaint, especially as the idea of Pokemon as a genre of game has been fairly normalized. We've had loads of games in recent years that have played with this formula. Temtem took creature collecting into the MMO world, first-person adventure Bug Snacks used interesting food-based mechanics to tell an interesting story, and Ooblets recently married creature collecting with the farming of Harvest Moon, all wrapped up in a whimsical Nobby Boy aesthetic. All those games took the root of an idea that they did not create but applied their own artistic vision, something borrowed and something new. But then there's Palworld. Palworld doesn't have its own whimsical aesthetic. Palworld looks like a Pokemon game. But Palworld also looks like a Zelda game. Like a lot like a Zelda game. Wait a second. When games copy each other, we don't usually call it plagiarism. Owning game mechanics is frowned upon. Nobody likes when companies patent them, and in general, we like it when developers take popular ideas and apply them to new games. Because no matter what, a game has to be fun to be successful. Unlike many other products, you can't just steal the recipe from another game and undercut their price to gain a market advantage. It doesn't stop people from trying, just search for Craft on Steam or your Nintendo Switch for proof of that. But popular new ideas applied to good games often sell. For example, Fortnite, the biggest gaming success of the 21st century so far, became successful by applying its world and gameplay to a popular new game mode. But it's also fair to say that Palworld is taking a lot of direct inspiration from a lot of games. The font treatment and chimes are ripped straight from recent Zelda titles, as is the climbing and the floating down on a sail, and the towers, and kind of the fast travel, and probably lots of other things I'm not really noticing. The survival and base building aspects of the game are pretty commonplace these days, reminiscent of titles like Ark or Valheim, and of course the boss fights and general use of pals is very much inspired by the Pokemon games, though crucially in real time and with guns. Eyebrows started to raise moments after Palworld burst onto the scene. Initially there were accusations that the studio had used AI tools to generate their own versions of the Pokemon, but those claims didn't hold up to scrutiny. Then last week 3D modelers matched the dimensions of many of the game's pals with existing models of Pokemon. Now that's a smoking gun. But then those modelers themselves were accused of fabricating the models they used in their videos to make it look like Palworld had stolen them. What's going on? Time will tell if somebody finds a smoking gun or if this is all just wishful thinking from Pokemon fans looking for retribution.
In fact, since I started writing this episode, the Pokemon Company has come out with their own statement, which amounts to, we're looking into it.
But I want to gauge the community on this. I'm not a massive Pokemon fan myself, even if I've played a few of the games. I need an expert. Somebody who was one of the first people to stream Palworld. Somebody with over 5 million subscribers on YouTube. Somebody with a cool Old Testament name like myself.
Wait a second, I know just the guy.
Hey all, my name is NoahJ456. I am a longtime Pokemon fan, huge gamer, and also a huge fan of Palworld.
Hi Noah, so how did you first react when you saw Palworld?
So my first reaction on seeing the first Palworld reveal trailer was this game looks absolutely hilarious. It's this bright, cheerful, cute monster catcher game, except in the middle of the trailer they just start injecting guns into it, have a bunch of pals all on a line just assembling AK-47s. I thought it was an absolutely hilarious idea, but was never really expecting an indie studio to be able to put out a game that actually held up to this and looked as fun as the reveal trailer did.
So do you think Palworld appeals to Pokemon fans, survival craft fans, or both?
When I look at a game like Palworld, I see a game that is essentially trying to do two different things, the first of which is just draw on people's nostalgia. However, once you get into the game, you discover it is a little something more. It's not just catching and fighting, it is also base building, it is also survival. It is definitely drawing on a couple different audiences here, which is why I think it makes it such a unique game.
As somebody who is admitted to being a Pokemon fan, what do you think about these accusations of plagiarism?
It's really funny to look on the internet and see a 100-tweet long thread. Here is every single Pokemon and their pal counterpart that was just stolen from Pokemon. You got people on the other side saying, stop defending Pokemon, billion-dollar corporation. These guys deserve to have everything stolen for their terrible games. Also, Palworld did nothing wrong. They didn't plagiarize anything. And as always with the internet, really hard to do. I think it is somewhere in the middle. This is just like two different games take on a ferret or a sheep. they're not going to look that different. They're going to look pretty similar no matter what kind of take you put on a ferret or a sheep. And then there's other ones like Anubis and Lucario, which these are a little bit harder to defend. It's really, really hard to say whenever you're just looking at this, and it's hard to know unless you were someone who was actually working on this game.
Would you like to see the Pokemon Company make a game like Palworld?
I would absolutely love it if Pikachu could have a grenade launcher and Charizard could have a bazooka, except I don't think they will ever do it for two reasons. The first of which is that the Switch is just not powerful enough of a console. They tried to do it with Pokemon Legends Arceus. They couldn't spawn in like more than 4 Pokemon on screen at one time before the console would just start crashing. It is simply not a powerful enough console for them to add anything, so I think it's held back by the hardware. And the second of which, and the more important, I guess, of the two, is that this game is a E for everyone game. Pokemon is supposed to be for everyone. It's not supposed to be this violent thing with guns or anything. And I think the Pokemon Company cares mostly about that more than anything else.
Okay, the golden question. Do you think people will be playing Palworld in a month's time?
And that is really, really hard to say because it does not have the staying power that Pokemon has. Even if you haven't played a Pokemon game in years, you still know a ton about Pokemon. There are movies, TV shows, board games, card games, everything you could think of. Pokemon is so prevalent in our society that you just see it walking down the street. That cannot be said of Palworld. So they don't have the luxury of just staying in people's minds. They have to keep it interesting with new content. Can they put out meaningful updates? It's been shown time and time again, a game can have massive success on launch, but fall off super, super quickly if they do not keep the community's interest with new updates.
Noah makes a great point there. Palworld's use of pals is definitely bringing people through the door, but it's the gameplay that's keeping them and helping them recommend the game to their mates. There's a blog post from the CEO of Pocket Pair which I read translated from his native Japanese to English with Google Translate, so I'm not going to quote him here, but the story of the game's development is wild because it seems not particularly well managed from a production or budget standpoint. The game cost 1 billion yen, or about $6.5 million US, and some of the key people they hired were either rejected for the job initially, or in one case was a hobbyist young adult who worked in a convenience store. And there's this wild story where the CEO, who had never used Unreal Engine before, was forced to optimize the game himself right before release because it was using too much memory and wasn't fit to be sold. In general, he also seems to be a fairly profit-motivated person, which tracks when you look at some of the games that Pocket Pair have made. Craftopia, which feels like a proto-Palworld in some ways, is very Breath of the Wild looking, and feels a lot like your Common Garden builder game. Nevergrave, The Witch and the Curse is a Metroidvania roguelike that looks a lot like Hollow Knight, and Overdungeon is one that has so many inspirations it's hard to pin it on one game in particular, but it's certainly derivative. I mean look, Pocket Pair aren't the only company doing this, and the chances are if this game hadn't exploded we wouldn't be looking at all these old games. But this ethos is largely backed up by the CEO himself. He calls their games safe. He says they're fun, but that they incorporate reliable game systems and then add good graphics. And most importantly, they're proven fun. His philosophy is that you don't need to break the bank by making the best game ever. You can just gameplay that's proven to work, wrap it in good art, and as long as you playtest it enough and make sure it's pretty fun, it has a chance of finding an audience. It's an incredibly unsexy way of talking about game design, one that my creative heart recoils upon hearing, but from a purely business perspective, he's not incorrect. If I'm being critical, I would say that this is game design by numbers. Somebody taking a few gameplay mechanics and an art style that seems popular and combining them. And if I'm being generous, well, perhaps this is what happens when people without a creative vision of their own decide to make a game. Like the video game equivalent of a cover band or an Elvis impersonator or all those terrible Jane Austen parody books. Because at the end of the day, it still requires skill and determination to learn an instrument or write a book or put on tight pants. And if there's one thing I know to be a fairly universal truth in games development, it's that making games is hard. Even if Palworld feels to me like it's lacking its own creative soul, it's a well-produced piece of software, one that many people are enjoying with their friends. And in that way it stands with games like Lethal Company or BattleBit, new indie spins on popular ideas that blew up overnight. And while Palworld certainly stands alone in how it looks like other games, the one thing they all share is that these are all games that you can experience with others. So I'm not sure what we can learn from Palworld. I certainly don't want the lesson to be, hey, just copy a bunch of other games, mash them together and cross your fingers. Maybe it's that the games market will always have an element of randomness, and that the next hit can truly come out of anywhere. Maybe the lesson is to listen to your fans, because if they're craving a game that you're not making, somebody else might get there ahead of you.
Or maybe the lesson is that in 2024, with so many AAA games keeping it safe, even something as superficially subversive as a cute animal holding a gun is enough to get you noticed. Yeah, there we go. There we go. That's the real Palworld right here. You want a rocket launcher?